So with me, I have Donald Rothberg, and I asked you to come, Donald, because of your history with social engaged Buddhism, and you're just such a wealth of knowledge with that. And I also, figured this would be a great conversation to have for the people who are already teaching the Dhamma or studying the Dhamma and what they need to know within their own sanghas, and
Mhm.
not only to find out more about your history and background, but also what could benefit them and how they teach the Dhamma, how they do their own social justice activities, et cetera, et cetera. Um, so, you've been involved in so many different things. You're in the Teachers Council at Spirit Rock. You've been practicing since 1976, and you've also have experienced Tibetan Dzogchen and Mahamudra practice, Hakomi, body-based psychotherapy, and somatic experiencing approaches, working with trauma.
Yeah, I've had trainings in those areas. Yeah,
Yeah, nice. And you've also been in faculty at University of Kentucky, Kenyon College, Saybrook University, right? And you certain.
actually, Saybrook's a graduate school. Yeah,
Okay, great. And
yeah,
you currently teach mindfulness of Vipassana. I know that I've been on a retreat with you. You lead a lot of retreats, and you have at Spirit Rock and a lot of other places, Vipassana retreats and loving kindness retreats, which I got to experience last January. That was wonderful. And you've written that book, Engaged Buddhism, that we can talk more about if you want to, as well as you're writing a book on working with a judgmental mind right now.
right. Yeah,
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to say in order to introduce yourself?
that's a pretty good introduction. Yeah. So I've really been teaching in some form since I was 19 years old because I started actually doing some teaching when I was an undergraduate, and they thought I was a graduate student. So teaching has been a vocation. And then also, I think an aspiration has really been to help develop Western spiritual practice in a way that's appropriate for the nature of our lives. So maybe we can go further into that, but that's one of my aspirations that can really help give a context for the socially engaged Buddhism.
Hmm. Okay, nice. And how long have you been interested in being socially engaged? Where did that come from?
Well, I think it came from my upbringing and my parents. We were really brought up to be very ethical. And, my ancestry is Jewish, but my parents, particularly my mom, sort of rebelled against some of the nature of religion, particularly what she took to be more dogmatic. And they became more interested in sort of social issues and social justice. They marched some with Dr. King in the civil rights movement, and that was a strong influence growing up. And also, the only time I ever went to summer camp was when I was 15 or 16 years old. It was in New York City, and it was the encampment for citizenship, and most of the counselors were fresh from the civil rights movement. I think it was in 1966. And it was probably about 40% African American. We have Native Americans there. And, I was very influenced by that when I was 15, about soon to be 16. So, and then that was the time of the Vietnam War. So I was very conscious of that. And when I went to college, At the time I was intending to be a scientist like my father, but the events of the time really led me to want to study the social issues, which I had been studying for some time. I mean, when that summer when I was in New York, I was age 15 and got a copy of Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, which is a fairly central book for that time. And so in college, I was in college at Yale University, and it was a very, very electric time. There were marches on Washington against the Vietnam War, many of which I went to. There was a lot going on many levels. When I was a sophomore in college, the whole university went out on strike in support of the right of Bobby Seale, a Black Panther, to have a fair trial, with the support of the faculty and the president. And so things were very intense, and I was spending a lot of my time, getting more informed. I spent the summer after my first year in college working in the US Congress, which was very informative, somewhat disillusioning, because I really came to see how people were not fundamentally interested in dealing with the issues. They were primarily interested in re-election. And if re-election coincided with dealing with the issues, great. If it didn't, dealing with the issues was in second place. And that was hard as a 19-year-old. And the summer after my second year in college, I got a fellowship to go study French, sort of left-wing student activism in Paris, and met with people and got much more informed about the European traditions of anarchism and socialism, and the traditions that had been going on were much more alive in Europe than they were in the US, partly because of the McCarthy period and the Red Scares and all that. So that was very strong. But at the same time, I was starting to look more deeply at human consciousness. It was a time of psychedelics and a fair amount of marijuana in the dorms, so to speak. And I also started studying psychology. I got interested in mysticism and in philosophy, and studied some of the, got also pulled towards understanding the nature of reality in my studies of philosophy and mysticism and so forth. So that was all part of the background. I also was somewhat questioning some of the ways that the activists related to each other. I was thinking of the line from, some of people probably know the line from Emma Goldman, the anarchist active at the beginning of the 20th century, who said, or this is ascribed to her, she didn't exactly say it, but if I can't dance in your revolution, I don't want to be part of it. And so I wondered about some of the ways that my fellow activists at college treated each other, and the levels of self-righteousness and dogmatism at times. And so, felt, as things developed, I felt, that it was kind of a natural vision to combine more inner work with being more active in the world. And that was sort of, there when I was in my early 20s. And that was sort of part of the background. And I got very interested in Buddhism, started, reading a lot about it, and then started doing retreats and meditating around 1976. Started meditating before that, but I did my first retreat in 76. And that was amazing. I felt like I had a home, but always there was the sense that the vision of connecting inner work with more outer work, or inner transformation with outer transformation. That was always part of the vision, along with wanting to find forms of practice appropriate for our culture and society.
Wow, that's so you were so wise at such a young age. So did you learn that from your parents or some leader, or did you just see that all the divisiveness and anger and animosity that was coming out of uh, movements against, for social justice?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I thought that the sort of the shadow side of activism was really, really strong. It was there, but I would say it was there and it concerned me. But yeah, no, I came to that vision really on my own. It was my own vision. And, over the years, some years later, I started reading Thich Nhat Hanh and learned about Buddhist peace fellowship. But for a while, it was somewhat lonely because I really got deeply involved in meditation. I was living in Boston. I started going to IMS in Massachusetts, started doing a lot of retreats, and eventually lived there for 6 months. So I was doing, I think I averaged about 100 days on retreat for 3 years, 100 days a year on retreat. And yet I was hearing, and I was thinking of going to Asia, becoming a monk, although I still had the vision, but I really got the message from the teachers there that if you really were serious about practice, you would just practice all the time doing formal meditation. And something about that really concerned me because there didn't seem to be much acknowledgement about community or daily life practice or even the whole realm of ethics, which is one of the three traditional areas of training. And so I started to really to question some of the teachers and the teaching. I mean, this is a general way that Western Buddhism has developed in many settings, especially around the Western retreat centers, that it's, we sometimes talk about weekly groups as meditation groups, right? And there's not much, there's some emphasis at times on daily life, but not much emphasis on ethics, even though it's one of the three areas of training. And for me, this was really, I could see all this, and it really led me to want to develop a different vision for practice that really, in one way to say it, it would bring together all the parts of our lives,
Hmm.
see them as practice.
Okay. So you included that intentionally within your own vision and your own practice,
Yeah.
not as much from the outside. Do you feel like that's changed? Do you think ethics are still lacking in Western Buddhism or?
Yeah, I think generally there's still a lack, very much. It's changed some, though. I think starting in the 1990s, there was more openness to socially engaged Buddhism. But I would say if you look at the teaching, in retreats or weekly groups, it's quite heavily, really quite heavily tailored to focus on formal meditation practice.
Mm,
With again, there's more attention to daily life practice. Often it's primarily framed in terms of mindfulness, though. I would say there's still not so much attention to the ethical dimension of practice,
wow.
which and not so much attention to daily life practice. I
Hmm.
would say it's still an issue, not so much attention to the social engaged dimension, although there's some, and there's much more than there was in the 1980s
Hmm.
when I was, seeing those things. Yeah.
Yeah, so you must have uh, picked up on, you had mentioned Thich Nhat Hanh and
Yeah.
how this Peace Fellowship, or what what did you learn from Thich Nhat Hanh and other Buddhist leaders that kind of helped you? Uh,
Yeah, I met Thich Nhat Hanh at a retreat in 1987. At that time, I was living in, I think I was living actually in Ohio. I lived in Kentucky and Ohio for 7 years, and then moved to California in 1988. But yeah, I went to a retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh, which was wonderful. It was about half Vietnamese people, and wonderful. I had known of his work before that, but it was wonderful to meet him. And I got involved with the Buddhist Peace Fellowship pretty soon, joined the board of the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, and worked closely with the Buddhist Peace Fellowship for about 12 years, and further for about another 5 or 6 years. Uh, you know, and that became a vehicle really to explore a lot of this. We developed, I developed along with Diana Winston, who is a teacher in LA, part of the Spirit Rock Teachers Council as well, and also May Lee Scott, who was a Zen teacher. We developed a program called the Buddhist, uh, it was called the BASE program, the Buddhist Alliance for Social Engagement. And over probably about 10 years, we developed training programs for people combining uh, Buddhist formal practice with engagement in the world. At the time, we talked about it as pretty broadly as involving service work. It could involve policy work. It could involve activism. So it wasn't just activism. It was really being involved. It could involve teaching, you know. And we had this program where we, most of the programs were 6 months long. And initially we met every week. I think some of them, we later moved it to every 2 weeks. And we had a one-day retreat every month. And at the beginning, we had a weekend retreat. At the end, we had a weekend retreat. And so it was pretty intensive training. And the training was on connecting the meditation and their work in the world. And that's out of that, out of those years of work, that's where my book, The Engaged Spiritual Life, came. Yeah. It came out of about 15 years of that kind of work.
mhm.
And it was a beautiful program. You know, we think we did about 30 programs, and you know, and we, you know, I wrote a manual along with Diana for it. So we, you know, we led a lot of them, and then we encouraged people to develop their own programs. So, you know, and I later did something similar for Spirit Rock. I did a 2-year training program called the Path of Engagement, which had about 50 people in it, for really integrating more inner practice with, you know, service and action in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, this is really wonderful. In fact, um, other than you, I haven't really heard much of this. I've
Yeah.
when I've gone on retreats or talked to other Buddhist teachers, and I could be just not talking to the correct people, but there seems to be a lack of conversation going on around how to bring your practice to social justice and, you know, engaging in social
It
justice.
really, you know, again, we thought of engagement. I've thought of engagement pretty broadly, as you know, with, you know, social justice activism being one of several different ways to be engaged. You know, which really would uh, sort of let each person say where they were drawn. You know, and again, some people, their work might be, you know, I remember we had one person who did educational policy work, and he was in the program, right? We had people who were working with the homeless, right, as their ongoing work, and they were in the program. You know, so it was pretty broad sense of engagement, but yeah, not not so many people. I mean, there also are some programs in Asia, in Thailand particularly, where that's been developed. And I became involved with the International Network of Engaged Buddhists, which was, based in Thailand especially, and the founders were Thai and Japanese, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I spent time particularly in Thailand, going to some of the conferences of the International Network of Engaged Buddhists, and we had a pretty broad network around the world.
Mm-hmm. So, what are some common themes when you're working with people to integrate their practice into their activism?
Or their engagement more broadly.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, well, that's the book. There are 10 chapters. There are chapters like, one of them would be actually grounding in ethical teachings and practice, which again, I think is largely neglected in Western Buddhism. Um, Even though, again, it's one of three fundamental areas of training, and we know it from the term, the Buddha taught sila, samadhi, and panya, right? And sila would be translated usually as ethical practice. And most of us know that through the 5 lay precepts on not killing, not stealing, and being careful with sexuality, developing wise speech, and being careful with substances which shift consciousness, right? And so grounding in ethics would be really crucial. Some of my colleagues in Engaged Buddhism think that all of Engaged Buddhism really comes out of taking the ethical precepts seriously. If you take the ethical precepts seriously, they're not just about one's face-to-face personal behavior, but they're also about what's going on in the world. Um, Thich Nhat Hanh said, "Do not kill, do not let others kill." Right? It's not just about oneself. And actually, when I've researched it, I have found passages in the teachings of the Buddha which actually have a social interpretation of some of the precepts. The Buddha also said something like that: "Do not kill, do not approve of others killing." I think there's one other phrase which I forget at the moment,
Uh,
but
do not promote, I think, is do not promote others to kill, or do not motivate others to kill.
yeah, it's basically somewhat of it was a social interpretation. And of course, it's better known that the Buddha was very outspoken about the caste system, didn't permit it in his own community, and so forth. So we can find elements of really taking the ethical precepts seriously in the Buddha. Can find them in later Buddhism. I think about 250 years after the Buddha, there was the King Ashoka of much of what we now call India, who outlawed the death penalty, believe it or not, whatever that is, 2,400 years ago, outlawed the death penalty. In fact, prohibited in certain contexts the killing of non-human animals.
Wow.
Do you believe that?
We've slid way far from that.
Yeah, and set up welfare stations for the poor and for non-human animals. That was all part of what King Ashoka did 2,400 years ago. So there are plenty of examples of that. And I think it comes out of taking the ethical precepts really seriously. So that was a major part of the training. And that could, so to really see that, and then we, would ask, to what extent am I harming, if there's something going on in my community that's harmful and I don't speak up, right? Or in my country, Or, of course, we could look to where do my tax dollars go? You know, my tax dollars are going towards the bombs landing in Gaza, right? Right. So, and I'm part of that. You're part of that. You know.
Mm.
So ethical training, very crucial. Another area of training is learning how to bring mindfulness off the cushion. Major part of daily life practice, but it could be really how do we develop mindfulness more and more when we're talking, when we're at work, when we're when we're at demonstrations. I remember we would sometimes groups of us would go to demonstrations and we would do sitting meditation at demonstrations. Yeah, interesting. So a lot of different areas. A lot of it would be, I think one area also was training and opening to pain and suffering. How can you do that? How do you open up to the suffering of the world? You know, and so trainings in that, sometimes we would study the figure of the Bodhisattva. In Buddhist tradition, one who's dedicated both to awakening and to helping others. Very, very important figure. Yeah, a lot of areas of training. Working with difficult emotions, an obvious one.
Mm-hmm.
In my own work, I was particularly interested in working with anger, because anger is very confusing for many, many people. And even a lot of the translations from Buddhist texts, I think, contribute to confusion about anger. Sometimes dosa, which is better translated as hatred, is translated as anger, making it seem like it's always bad. It's a major issue for anyone engaged. How do you work with anger? And it's also very confusing because in the Western tradition, anger is something that you find with the Jewish prophets, God, and Jesus. They all get angry. And then in the Christian tradition, anger is also one of the 7 deadly sins. Sound like a good setup for confusion?
Yeah, yeah, it is very confusing, and yet it's very motivating and mobilizing.
Yeah. And what I found in my own practice and investigation is that anger is actually at its depths connected with sadness, and beneath the sadness is love. And so, but if you don't do practice with anger, you can really go into reactivity. Anger can be the basis for reactivity, for all sorts of unskillful ways of acting, demonizing the opponent. I've sometimes done workshops and trainings for activists. And I remember one workshop I did, it was at a conference on spiritual activism, interfaith conference. And I did a conference on what kind of training is important for spiritual activists. And I asked people before I said what I was going to say, and kind of gave the outlines of a curriculum. I asked them, what are the main issues for you? And the first one they named was, we're really nasty with each other in our organizations. Very often, and that's so, and I think I've actually done some workshops specifically for activists on working with anger and being judgmental. And so that's, so working with difficult emotions, a very crucial area of training. So those are a few of the, initial areas that people would do training. And then in our actual training groups, people would typically bring back all sorts of issues from their lives, and we would work with them in our meetings. So that was very, very crucial.
I would think that mindfulness of the thinking mind and our narratives,
Yeah.
not only passed down through, our generational narratives from our generations, as well as, um, our political narratives and social narrative, all these different things would have to be also explored. Was that part of your training?
Oh,
Looking.
yeah. Yeah. It's generally mindfulness of one's thoughts and emotions and body states, and expanding that to particularly being aware of narratives and storylines of all kinds. Really, it's a foundation. Yeah.
Yeah, and did you motivate people to not only bring mindfulness to their storylines, but also to maybe soften around them or let them go somewhat?
Well, that would be the result of the mindfulness. They would, yeah, they might notice they have a very strong negative judgment about a coworker, so they would work with that and work through it, or that they're demonizing the enemy. And in some ways, I think the vision, that for me is at the heart of socially engaged Buddhism, very explicit with Thich Nhat Hanh, or someone like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who talks about the beloved community in which everyone has a place, very parallel to the Buddha's teaching on universal metta, right? Metta for all beings, loving kindness for all beings, compassion for all beings, all the heart qualities extended to all beings. And so, yeah, looking at the extent to which one demonizes one opponent's a really crucial part of practice. Yeah,
Yeah, I see that on a huge scale right now.
yeah,
With a lot of my, as a therapist, a lot of my clients are struggling with anger and animosity against the other political side that they perceive to be their enemies.
right.
Um,
Right. So really a key, and I think a key to our time is bringing the heart qualities into the social domain. And I actually think developing empathy is one of the keys to working through polarization in our country. Uh, Empathy means that one can tune into and understand another person, including someone with different views. Empathy doesn't mean you agree with the person. And, I think of one retreat that I was part of, an interfaith retreat, where we were at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, where they build nuclear weapons. And we had an interfaith retreat there, and the authorities let us have a retreat there, but they wouldn't permit us to use their bathrooms. We had a 5-day retreat. We camped out in the neighboring state park, and we go every day. They let us stay in the parking lot. We actually bought, or we rented an RV that had a bathroom and also provided some shade. And we meditated there most of the day. And then at lunchtime, they permitted us to go in the cafeteria. And we would have our lunches with the scientists and technicians who were researching and building nuclear weapons. And some of the people in our group got into arguments with the people, disagreed. I tried to develop empathy and really listen to the people. And when I did that, I could hear that they were coming out of thinking that they were working for the basis of having greater security. And I could agree that security is an important thing. I would disagree with the strategy for developing security, but I could empathically understand where they were coming from. And a lot of us did that in that situation. I think that is just such a fundamental tool for working with polarization, or really with any disagreements, you know. And in my teaching on wise speech, which I've been teaching retreats on wise speech for about 20 years. Empathy is a big part of the retreat. Learning empathy is a part of skillful speech practice. So really, really crucial for being with polarization. Yeah. And not always so easy.
Yeah, I would think that is there any kind of motivation for people to speak from their own personal experience when they're using wise speech when it comes to, this kind of work?
Say again, is there?
Is there any emphasis on people speaking from their own personal experience instead of,
Well, I see. Yeah, as opposed to being judgmental of another person.
or speaking for a large group of people,
Oh,
or assuming that they know what
they,
they're feeling, or
that usually that some version of that would be a guideline for, I think, for being with people with different views or working with conflicts. I also teach retreat on being skillful with conflicts. And,
Mhm.
one has to, kind of establish the relationship first before you can get to a difficult thing. So being very, very careful with making assumptions or generalizations about others. And speaking out of one's experience is an important guideline, at a certain point. I mean, one can go beyond it and talk about, maybe generalizations about the world, but it's good to ground those in individual experience.
Yeah, you had mentioned before that Buddhism has a history of working with oppression or side by side with oppression.
That who does?
Buddhism?
Oh yeah. That it that say again that Buddhism can sometimes has been oppressive.
Well, went hand in hand with oppression,
Yeah,
Buddhism.
yeah. You can find that historically sometime. Uh, there's a yeah. I mean, many examples. The current government of Burma purports to be Buddhist. Buddhist monks in Burma have contributed to violence. Um, you can find, I think, in Sri Lanka, when it's been a Buddhist country, has sometimes justified wars on the basis of Buddhism. That being said, compared to the other religions, the track record of Buddhism is way, way cleaner. There are very, very few wars that are on behalf of Buddhism. But another example would be in Japan in the first part of the 20th century. There was a very close collaboration between Japanese fascism and Zen Buddhism. And historically, there's been a strong connection between Zen and sort of the warrior tradition in Japan. And I personally have actually we had some gatherings with the International Network of Engaged Buddhists where I've heard Japanese Zen teachers give apologies for what happened in Japan from more or less from 1900 to 1945. And they said explicitly, we forgot the ethical dimension. That was their language. The whole of Zen Buddhism didn't really take ethics seriously for a long period, and that permitted collaboration with fascism and militarism. There's a famous line from a Zen teacher at that time. He said something, probably most people know the phrase, when you eat, just eat. When you talk, just talk. Well, in Zen, they said, when you march, just march. When you shoot, just shoot.
Wow.
That's in the history. There's
Okay.
some good scholarship that came out in the last 30 years about that,
Mhm.
about what happened in Japan during that time. Not very pretty.
Yeah. I guess people can take any, you know, beautiful teachings like this and use them to further their negative motives.
People can use them. Also, I would say that it's partly comes out of the fact that traditional Buddhism tended to be monastic and didn't really have a strong socially engaged perspective.
Hmm.
So that's some of the background for this as well.
Do you feel like that's changing?
Well, Western Buddhism certainly doesn't have a strong connection with monasticism,
Okay, yeah.
for one thing. But um, I think you can find it in some places, and I have to think that the demands of our times, with the climate crisis and the threats, the many, many threats to in many countries, but many threats in the U.S. like right now, threats to democracy and so forth. That very crucial to have a notion of Buddhist practice that is grounded in ethics, and that the way I frame it, it's not so much like you extend Buddhist practice to social engagement. One way I say it is that we have practice in all the parts of our lives, and social engagement, being a citizen, is a part of our lives. That's a way to talk about it a little more broadly.
Mm. Yeah, I went to a Buddhist conference once, and I don't remember who the Buddhist teacher was speaking, but he was saying something like, as a Buddhist practitioner, it's so important that you get involved in activism in some way because you've got to practice and you can bring your practice to your activism. And he was trying to motivate all the practitioners to really take their practice from inner to inner and outer.
Yeah, I think that's the long-term vision, and we also have to recognize that each person, number one, might have a different area of engagement. Like in our program, some people's engagement was working with the homeless. And among people I work with now, I think that one person's engagement is doing 5 hours of volunteer work with a climate group, right? That's so it doesn't have to be what we usually call activism. That's one point.
Mm.
And then the other important point is that there also are cycles where we give more attention to inner work and other times when we give more attention to outer work. And I know that's been true for me, that I've had once I've had the larger vision, I think it's all been part of the picture, but there have definitely been times when I felt more called to do retreats or to do more inner work, like around, um, you know, around my own psychological work, or uh, or on the other hand, more time to go more outwardly. So there are cycles. We're not saying that everyone should always be doing all of this all the time. There are cycles, and I think there's something really. But I think when we really touch our hearts and listen to our hearts, it's really listening for what matters for each person.
Hmm.
That guides us. And there are times we put in more attention or more energy in one area than the other,
Hmm.
especially when we're beginning practice. Sometimes it's makes sense to, people get really involved with wanting to do a lot of retreats.
Hmm.
But then at a certain point, there might be a movement to have a more integrated sense. So,
For me, I can only speak from my own experience that I know, like you and I led a session on working with the Palestinian Israeli conflict, few
right.
sessions on that. And I found with my own personal practice that there are times that I feel overwhelmed and that I can't, activism or doing anything, forwarding, and that I'm just not in the place to do it because I feel frozen or
Yeah.
up or trauma is being reignited or something. So that to me is an invitation to go inner and do some inner healing, maybe some therapy on that. And then as I feel stronger, then I can start feel stronger inner wise. I can start doing more outer work. And I
Yeah, and I want to add a point that hasn't come up so much. It's kind of implicit
Mm,
in the when I was talking about the training programs and the groups. I would say that a really crucial middle area is community and small groups. And they can play a very crucial role in exactly what you were just talking about. Um, that a lot of our numbness or frozenness, some of it has to be looked at. Maybe it's a reactivation of old trauma. We need to work maybe in therapy, but some of that a lot of it can be worked with really skillfully in a group or a community. And I think of, for example, a time when I was working a lot with the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. I think I had moved to California a year or two. It was around 1989, 1990. And I was doing a lot in relation to what we feared would be a war, which turned out to be the first Gulf War. And I was doing a lot of writing, a lot of developing of materials, a lot of international connections. And I remember, I think it was around, I don't know, February or March, I forget the exact time, of 1990, the war actually started and the US more or less invaded Iraq and started dropping bombs. And I remember we had a Buddhist Peace Fellowship meeting the very evening that happened. It was very intense. And I also had a training that was scheduled way ahead of time. I think a 4 or 5 day training with Joanna Macy to be trained to lead her work. And uh, one of her practices is a group practice called the Truth Mandala. And we did this in this training. It's a practice, takes about an hour and a half. And at the heart of it, people gather together in a circle. In this training, we had 70 people in a circle. And the inner part of the circle has 4 quadrants, which are named to refer to 4 difficult emotions. I think fear, sadness, anger, and confusion. And people could go into the circle insofar as they were experiencing one of these. Stay there, speak to the whole group. The whole group, after each person spoke, would say, "We hear you." Went on for quite a time. I was numb after the attacks by the US. I couldn't do anything. I felt really numb. That particular ritual practice, I connected with my anger, my fear, and it totally opened up. The numbness disappeared.
mm,
I was able to actually act very, very fully for the next few months on those issues. So I want to mention that because that can happen in groups and in small communities, and that becomes like an intermediate holder. So there's individual practice, there's the group, different kinds of practices, and there's one's action in the world. You
mm.
know.
There's a lot of fear right now with
Yeah,
our political situation. I know that a lot of organizations are pulling back on DEIA and uh, different people are afraid politically to make what they're feeling or saying known. And as Dharma teachers, I found that there's uh, there's certain things that we can and maybe not do, as far as when we're leading our sanghas or giving Dharma talks or how to answer questions. So, from a Dharma teacher perspective, what are some of the things that you would suggest that they can do, and what are some of the landmines to avoid?
Yeah. I think teaching that grounds in ethics is a great starting point. And ethics can be both a framework to see what's going on. To what extent is that unethical? To what extent is there lying, pervasive lying? Which is you know, I mean, it's well documented, shall I say, with the current president. I think the Washington Post tabulated. I think they found an average of 30 a day.
Oh,
Right. So starting with the ethical precepts, and I think one can really see ways that the Buddhist teachings and practices can give perspectives for understanding the current situation. And I think, like, for example, bringing a framework of seeing the roots of problems in greed, hatred, and delusion doesn't privilege one political party in the US or another. And so I think, in going into this area, I usually like to have a kind of a preface, partly like when I've done talks through Spirit Rock, I talk about Spirit Rock being a nonprofit and what are the guidelines for what people associated with a nonprofit can or cannot do. And generally, they can't engage in partisan politics, which is basically refers to elections. But they can engage in education about social and political matters. That's perfectly fine. I also try to say right at the beginning that that I don't want to, as it were, privilege one particular political view, particularly connected with a party or not, and want to have room for everyone. And in that context, I might talk about empathic understanding. That being said, I can apply a framework and see the roots of problems in greed, hatred, and delusion, and apply it to what's going on right now. Yeah. But I like to say that there's room for everyone, and that so in some contexts, like when I've taught retreats and classes on Buddhist practice and transforming racism, I've started with a number of guidelines. And in the retreats, I had people form the guidelines themselves. I think in both contexts, I would suggest just a few, but then people formed their own guidelines. I think in the first time I taught Buddhist practice and transforming racism, we had 24 guidelines, which gave plenty of room, which really stressed the value of empathy and understanding, not being judgmental of others, being really careful with that, giving room for everyone while, having room for saying, I disagree with that. So guidelines can be really crucial where things are, where there's some different views and conflicts. The guidelines are rooted in ethics and in Buddhist practice. So that can be really crucial. I think, what are some other things to watch out for? Um,
I wanted to say that right now it's really big, and it seems powerful to do a land acknowledgement
yeah,
and to acknowledge that the Buddha was of different descent, and that we're appropriating his teachings in the West, which has changed things. Do you feel like this is part of that whole ethical landscape? An important part of
acknowledging the history, and I mean, it's very related to engaged Buddhism because we're receiving the teachings. I wouldn't probably use the word appropriate.
Okay.
I would say we're receiving the teaching because they were very explicitly given to us by Asian teachers. I was present at a lot of the gatherings where that was, it was almost a ritual. But that, you know, one way of saying is that we're trying to make it real for our lives, and we can recognize that our lives are different than the monks, particularly 2,600 years ago, and later the nuns. You know that our lives are different. And one way I've thought about it systematically is that I've thought of the Buddha as talking about ignorance, and primarily referring to not knowing anicca, dukkha, anatta, impermanence, dukkha. The main form is I would translate as reactivity, and then not self, not knowing those, and not knowing nibbana or nirvana. And that is, ignorance of that is what the Buddha taught. But I think in our time, we have to relate to two other forms of ignorance. One I would call more psychological ignorance, and the other I would call ignorance related to social conditioning. We can think of all the conditioning we have about gender and race and class and all sorts of things. And the psychological conditioning is related to that, but could be related to one's own upbringing and what you got from the family and the limiting beliefs that come from one's own difficulties as a child. A lot of material, or traumatic events in one's life. So I think of there being, so recognizing that we're really, our practice is going to look differently than it did in the teachings of the Buddha. Mm.
Okay. Thank you. Um, so the last training I was at, they were talking about not only just acknowledging the Native
Yeah,
Americans that once lived on the land wherever we're teaching, but also to acknowledge the earth and all the living beings on the earth that are rising from the earth, and how important it is to um, acknowledge all of our interconnectivity
yeah,
with all life forms.
with all beings. Yeah, to do that, if it's helpful to do that at the beginning, and that should be part and parcel of the teachings as well.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah, really, really crucial. And it's more explicit in Mahayana. Some of the teachings in Mahayana are way more explicit about interconnection. You know,
Okay. So people who are teaching, let's say that I went to a demonstration
yeah,
over the weekend. Is it okay to talk about the demonstration and how I participated in a talk or with my community afterwards, or you do keep that to yourself? Or
sure, it could be fine. Yeah, if you wanted to. I mean, teaching usually has a point that we're trying to get to or exploring a teaching. So it would be in that context. So you could explore, okay, how was it to practice mindfulness at the demonstration?
Mhm.
Or um, how do I see my participation in the demonstration following from my ethical commitment? So I would try to frame it in terms of a particular teaching, while also to the extent that there might be people with different views, and we want to allow for the different views. So we bring in what I was talking about earlier.
Mm.
We don't want to, we have to be really careful because the teacher role is a role in which teachers, in a sense, have more power. And we can abuse that power. And we have to be careful, recognizing that what we say will have some influence related to the power of the role. And we want to be careful. And yeah, so if I was going, if I'm personally planning to go to in 2 days to the No Kings demonstration, right?
Right.
Um, and so if that was a part of my teaching, and actually on Sunday, I'm going to be teaching for one of the sanghas I teach for, and I'll be talking about engaged practice, right? So I might talk about the demonstration, but I want to have room for everyone's views. And there could be people who are sympathetic to the aim and who think this strategy isn't so helpful. It could be all sorts of views.
Hmm.
But I would want to connect it to practice, and not, what we want to avoid is just suggesting, oh, I'm a good person because I went there, or this is a good thing. I think connect everything with practice and training and teachings.
And
That's
your
crucial.
ethics too. That's wonderful. So for people to become, can you show us your book again? It's a really good roadmap for.
Good starting point. Yeah. The book is, I brought it here, The Engaged Spiritual Life.
Okay.
I see it as a training manual. So it's divided into chapters on different aspects of training. I won't read all the chapters, but the second one was mindfulness in action.
Mm,
I think the first one has a lot on ethics. Now, chapter 3, clarifying and setting intentions. Chapter 4, opening to suffering, opening to compassion. Chapter 5, by taking care of myself, I take care of the world.
mm.
Chapter 6, not knowing but keeping going. Chapter 7 on interdependence. Another chapter on transforming anger. Another one on acting with equanimity. And the last one's on committed action, non-attachment to outcome.
Mm. Nice.
So that's a good starting point.
Great.
And I have a lot of talks also on Dharma seed, some of them recent.
Mm,
Um, and there are different teachers also who teach engaged Buddhism. On my website, I have a reading list,
mm. And what's your website?
donaldrothberg.com.
Okay.
Yeah, and there, I think reading Thich Nhat Hanh is great.
Hmm.
Um, in the current time, my colleague Tanisara has been very active, and you can look at her website, an organization. It's called Sacred Mountain Sangha.
Nice.
You can look to the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. They're doing good things, not as quite as strong generally as it was when I was part of it.
Hmm. Okay.
But yeah, I think Thich Nhat Hanh, and there's some good histories. Also, it's good to read the history. Yeah,
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I think this will be very helpful to the folks in this program. And you have such a wealth of knowledge and experience. And I really love your emphasis on, grounding yourself in ethics first and also bringing mindfulness to whatever's arising and having the intention for compassion and empathy. Beautiful things.
yeah. I mean, the ethics practice isn't just about engagement. It's about bringing, like I say, ethics is generally neglected in Western Buddhism. And I once worked with a group for 6 months, and we had 1 month of practice each on the first 5 precepts, and then the last month bringing them all together.
Hmm. Wow.
So it's not just about engagement, but it's just about how you are to people close to you,
Yeah,
about developing skillful speech, etc.
that's
So
beautiful. Yeah,
really, yeah.
Very crucial. Okay, thank you so much, Donald.
Thank you, Ronya, for the invitation and the questions, the discussion, and your own sharing from your own experience.
Yes, thank you so much.
You're very, very welcome.